Chapter 16. They overslept and made the decision to grab breakfast at the first drive-thru they could find. It was a late start to begin with, and their entry back to the highway was further delayed by Hector's need to find a flower shop to prepare for the mountain destination. The 110-degree weather radiated from the car windows as they passed through the Virgin River Gorge. Heat caused the eastbound drivers to speed faster than Hector expected for such a tight and winding two-lane highway through the canyon. It was all in an effort to get beyond the vast desert and up to higher elevations with cooler temperatures and cooler winds. Frankie's phone reception went in and out of service. Hector's phone reception was useless, with the exception of a few small towns that still allowed for a choppy signal. The smell of high desert sage arrived with a blanket of the dusty green brush that covered the surrounding valleys and mountainsides. During the last hours of the drive, occasional cattle guards rattled as Chromefoot sped over their horizontal bars. Signs warned Hector and Frankie about crossing deer. Most of the signs were decorated with bullet holes of all sizes. They met another cattle guard as they passed a sign welcoming them to the national forest. The sign brought on a flood of adrenaline and some nausea, which caused Hector to pull over and retch. Hector blamed it on the bending road that wrapped closely up the mountain, but Frankie could feel the doubt building in the atmosphere of the car. Even with his doubts, they were too far into the trip to turn back. The altitude was getting high enough that Hector's temples began to feel tight with pressure. Frankie took some pain relievers with a gas station fountain soda. Hector did the same and did his best to chuckle when she attempted to lighten the mood, proclaiming, "Down the hatch, old man." He knew they were close after passing a sign that read, "Elevation, 9,800 feet." "How are we doing on time?" Frankie asked. "Pretty perfect, actually. And look, off to the east, the full moon is already on the way up." As they neared the pull-off, his anxiety turned to a wily anticipation. He pulled Chromefoot off the highway bend just before the gravel shoulder transitioned into a steep drop. Between gusts of wind, the silence of the mountain caused their ears to ring as Hector gestured toward the location of the accident. Frankie got a head start as Hector followed her to the cliff's edge, and he was momentarily overwhelmed with the desire to protect her. In the far-off distance, the pale sandstone of the Henry Mountains took on the orange glow of the late afternoon. Somewhere in the shade of the mountain below was the location of tall grass and ponderosa pine where his parents were found. Across the highway lanes stood the thick hillside of aspen trees where the deer had come trotting out at their car. Hector peered into the trees and imagined the deer amongst the shady details. After thinking through a handful of scenarios involving his parents and the deer, he walked back up the pavement to Chromefoot. Frankie looked back and caught him whispering something to the green car, and when he returned to meet her at the bend, his arms were filled with the flowers he'd bought in Las Vegas. He handed them off to Frankie before running another lap to the car, and then he returned with a grocery bag of contents he hadn't mentioned to her. She'd never seen a photo of Hector's parents, but the first frame he drew from the paper bag was what Frankie immediately identified as a wedding photo. The second photo was developed from a disposable camera that was mailed to Hector by the county sheriff. It was a photo his parents had likely taken of themselves the day of the crash. They were much older in the digital pixels of the more recent photo, both with the wider, adult faces that inevitably come with age. But the look in their eyes across both photos expressed a kind of open joy. For a moment, Frankie thought about the recent change to her face that would sometimes surprise her in the mirror. When the face of her youth, that had been with her all along, had become an adult behind her back on some uneventful night. Hector stood back as Frankie knelt to make the remaining adjustments to the flowers and photos of the highway memorial. Once more, Hector walked to the car and returned, this time with his phone for pictures. "I'm so glad you're here," he said before kissing her. They remained in a silent embrace and lost track of time, gazing at the red and white desert that was now taking on the deeper colors of the sunset in the distance. "Are you okay?" Frankie asked. "Yeah," Hector replied. "This was such a good idea, Frankie. Thank you." Hector took a picture of Chromefoot resting on the gravel shoulder. The air was cooling, with the darkening hours, and a mountain breeze filled Frankie's arms with goosebumps. Readying their gear for the hike wouldn't take long since they'd packed light. The walking trail to the lake would be steep, but it was only 2 miles long and surrounded by the shade of mixed pine and aspens. I just had this feeling that I'm further from home than I'd like to be. Like, I can feel the distance between me and my friends, and I think I just need a minute to breathe. Is that okay? Of course. Let's sit on the trunk and take it all in. There's no rush. Plus, this altitude is brutal. My head fucking hurts. It's as if all the fluids in my body are drying up and gasping for some moisture that isn't there, Hector said with a concerned tone. You're gonna be okay, she laughed. I'm good. Just a little homesick for the 4th, maybe. I think I feel the same. We could be behind the house right now with everyone, but I'm glad we're out here instead. And if it's too much to hike up there and camp tonight, I completely support whatever you want to do, Hector offered. No way, she smiled with a calm expression. We just needed a moment to catch our breath. I can't wait to get up there, she announced softly. Plus, this already gets the award for most unique 4th of July I've ever had. It's perfect. We got plenty of water, and I got plenty of snacks and supplies. I got sparklers and I got booze. We're definitely celebrating once we get there. You did not. He flashed the open zipper of the side of his camping pack to show her the fireworks he'd picked up at the gas station outside Vegas. We can stand in the lake and light them, just to be safe. Always so safe, Mr. Hector. Si, senora, he replied proudly. Although you should know, I'll kill you if you get me involved with torching a national forest, she said with a playful body check. Understood, he confirmed with a faux shaken tone. Meadows of tall grass and scattered black volcanic boulders surrounded them as they entered and exited gatherings of aspens and mixed pine. The shade of early evening produced an ideal temperature, with a mixture of summer heat and chilled mountain breeze. Hector occasionally exaggerated his breaths to lighten the mood. Rest stops became more frequent with the rising altitudes and the weight of their gear. When they stepped into a new cluster of aspen trees, a breeze wound into something more powerful, and the leaves shimmered all around them. It reminded Hector of the trees and piano back in Pasadena, and he thought of the illegal fireworks that were surely beginning to fill the sky back in LA. Hector hadn't expected the darkness beneath the trees to arrive so quickly, but there was still enough daylight for them to make their way. After the way we met, I should have known I'd be back out in some uncharted trees with you before too long, Frankie announced with short breaths. Isn't this romantic? Hector coughed in a strained laugh. But hey, we're not far now, and at this rate we'll get the fire going before it gets too dark. We'll have the full moon lighting up the lake for us too, Frankie added with a pleased tone. Hector had researched the mountain endlessly since the accident, but the lake was something completely different beyond the boundaries of his laptop screen as the water emerged from behind the silhouetted forest. The lake had banks of sand and volcanic stone with trees surrounding it on all sides. Hundreds of feet above the trees on the opposite side of the lake stood towering cliffs that were too deep for any plant life to grow. The trees surrounding the lake had the presence of cathedral spires. Huddled shoulder to shoulder, they had a force that Hector could feel in his stomach. He acknowledged a moment of intimidation as he paused to comprehend the power of the mountain. How many years had these trees seen? This lake? It was already difficult for him to ignore the effects of the altitude on his body and the lack of the city sounds. That combination, along with this new feeling of being caught in the current of the mountain's forces, exhausted his spirits. His idea of comfort was tied to droning freeway sounds and light pollution. But then he thought proudly to himself about their safe arrival there and the good fortune of the weather and the full moon. They located a fire pit and set up their gear. Wind scattered ripples on the lake's surface, blurring the reflection of the cliffs in the sky above. Once they'd eaten, Hector's perspective was less haunted by the mountain. They played cumbia music from a portable speaker, and they howled and danced with sparklers in the shallow water. The feeling of enduring the drive and making it to this place he'd thought of for so long created a brief surge of life in both their bodies. But as soon as they sat down on the sand near the water, Frankie fell asleep in his lap, spilling her paper cup of wine onto his jeans. The day driving had been long, and processing the spectrum of emotions from the roadside memorial left them drained. Hector helped Frankie into her sleeping bag, and they slept deeply into the night. Hector opened his eyes and sat up in the tent after realizing he'd left the portable speaker playing down by the water. There was the option to allow it to continue to play on, but he wanted to save its power so they could utilize it in the morning. Shaking his head in the darkness of the unknowable late hour, he was annoyed to hear the portable device playing Beethoven's Für Elise just loud enough to give him the chills. After slowly unzipping the tent, he stepped out into the cool air wearing his boxers and his shoes. The mountain silence was so disorienting that he paused to focus on the effect it was having on him. The music was there, playing from somewhere in the moonlit dark, and then it was obvious. Fleur Elise wasn't coming from the speaker, but from directly across the lake, or from somewhere at the center of the lake itself. Managing the shoreline of dirt and volcanic rocks leading down to the water, Hector stepped slowly and carefully until his knees were submerged. Leaves and branches rustled around the lake, and the sound of the quiet mountain wind gently filled his ears as the piano played on. When the piece came to an end, the opening notes of Debussy's The Girl with the Flaxen Hair began filling the space across the water. Closing his eyes, he remained still in the water, and he listened until the song's last notes met the silence of the lake once more. Then, without hesitation, he leapt headfirst into the water toward the center of the lake. He jolted awake in his sleeping bag and sat up to find the blurred glow of dawn inside the tent. Hector shook his head as he attempted to understand and remember every detail of what had just happened, and he moved quietly to find his notebook that was somewhere in the darkness next to his sleeping bag. The high altitude caused Frankie to gasp powerfully, and the tent smelled enough to awaken her. She began an embarrassed apology until she realized Hector was not there with her. She unzipped the tent. The sky above was blue with the morning sun, and the lake was still shaded from any direct rays of light. When she spotted him, he waved from a canoe at the center of the lake with a large rock in his hand, before flopping off the side of the small boat into the water. It was outside of Hector's serious nature to be so playful, and she enjoyed the surprise of this unexpected decision of his. But after nearly a minute had gone by, Hector hadn't come back up for air. Without further thought, Frankie ran swiftly across the sand and into the cold mountain water. She swam with panicked strokes until she spotted Hector wading toward her with the canoe in hand. He smiled as she floated to him. "Look up," he said, motioning with his chin. The first direct sunlight of the day was glowing near the top of the cliffs, above the far side of the lake. "Doesn't that look insane? I would punch you right now if this view wasn't so gorgeous, you know," she said, half infuriated. "Do you have any idea how scary that whole staying underwater thing was?" Hey, I'm sorry, he laughed. "I just ran from my sleeping bag into a full sprint out here without even stopping to question if you were fucking with me, dude." "Frankie, I promise it wasn't meant as a joke or to scare you," he answered before grinning. "And check out this canoe I found, girl." With this, Frankie splashed water at Hector's face. "Just tell me next time, dummy," she smiled. "Can we please get out now?" He looked like he might cry and pulled her close for a kiss. "What's wrong?" she asked with some confusion. "Nothing. This is the best I've felt in fucking forever. I left them a letter, Frankie." "What?" "I had this dream last night. A Beethoven song was playing from a piano somewhere out here." "On the lake?" "Yes. Fleur Elise, the song Renee always plays." "Oh shit," she responded with a look of disbelief. "Yeah, after that I couldn't sleep," he said as his arms moved beneath the water. "I know it's crazy, but it was like they were telling me everything is okay." "Were you scared?" "I don't know. Before I could think about it, I got up and wrote them a letter. I wanted them to know that I was okay too." "And that rock in your hand?" "That was just so the letter would stay at the bottom of the lake." "God, I was so scared swimming out here," she said, looking up to the treetops. "I told them about you too." He smiled as tears welled up around his eyes. They spent the rest of the day by the fire. When the night arrived, they ate, they drank, and they danced with the lake and the trees below the rock cliffs. On Sunday morning, they broke down camp by the lake and skipped stones across the water. Feeling a reluctance to begin the hike back down the mountain, they took their time. The 12-hour drive would deliver them back into the modern world too soon. It would first greet them in Las Vegas and then subside before gathering in force to welcome them a second time below Cajon Pass. They passed below firs and spruce trees until gatherings of aspens between the meadowlands met them like a dream. Hiking downward allowed for more leisurely paces and conversation than the ascent had days before. Hector's mind was calm. Writing the letter by the fire and releasing it left him with a slight shiver once again. More than anything, it left him reeling with joy as the impact of their downward steps began to burn behind his left knee.